To cure a wealthy Korean-American family's newborn son from a curse called Grave's Call, a renowned Korean shaman decides to excavate the ominous grave of a vengeful ancestor spirit that had been haunting the family, unleashing dreadful consequences in the process. Renowned Korean shaman Hwarim and her protege Bong Gil are on their way to Los Angeles to see the newborn son of a wealthy Korean-American family that hired them. The family's accountant fetched them from the airport and brought them to the hospital, where the newborn son is. Hwarim and Bong-gil stayed outside the baby's room for a bit as the accountant convinced the mother of the baby, Ji-young-cheo, who didn't trust that the shaman and her protege could help the baby, to let Hwarim and Bong-gil do their job. Once inside the room, the accountant briefed Hwarim and Bong-gil about the baby's condition, while Hwarim was whistling as she stared at the baby. She stopped whistling and turned to Ji-young-cheo, the accountant, and the nurse, requesting that they leave them alone for a while. Ji-young-cheo was reluctant, but went out with the accountant and the nurse anyway. Once Hwarim and Bong-gil were the only ones left in the room, Bong-gil stood by the newborn son with his eyes closed and chanted a mantra, while Hwarim waited for him to finish. Once he was done, Hwarim gently pried the baby's eye open and looked into it. Ji-young-cheo, the accountant, and the nurse returned inside the room, and Hwarim told them that the baby must have a condition similar to that of his grandfather. Ji-young-cheo and the accountant were surprised by what she said, as Hwarim was never told about the condition of the baby's grandfather. Hwarim and Bong-gil were then brought to the wealthy Korean-American family's mansion, where she talked to the newborn son's father, Park Ji-young. Hwarim and Bong-gil looked up when they heard the sound of a glass shattering and the screams of the grandfather, Jong-sun, who seemed to have gone crazy. Ji-young started the conversation by talking about his brother, who had taken his own life in a mental hospital. Just like his father, who was still screaming upstairs, his brother used to scream a lot too, and now it's happening to his newborn son. At first, Hwarim thought that it might just be a genetic disease that they couldn't figure out. However, she noticed that there seemed to be a pattern. The only ones getting this mysterious disease are the sons or grandsons. Hwarim also explained that she saw a shadow in the house when they arrived. She suspected that it was Ji-young's grandfather's shadow. Ji-young was surprised by what she said and asked what he needed to do to appease his angry ancestor. Hwarim answered that she just needed some money and get help from certain people she knows. In a cemetery in South Korea, a feng shui master and geomancer who specializes in finding and selling burial lands to wealthy families, Kim Sang-deok and a mortician, Yong-jun, excavated a grave to check the bones of a wealthy family's grandmother. Yong-jun stayed behind to check the coffin, while Sang-deok went to talk to the late grandmother's son, Chairman Kim. Yong-gun had laid the bones on the ground, surrounded by her family. Sang-deok and Chairman Kim approached them, and the former asked who had the grandmother's dentures, but no one was able to give an answer. The attention went to a young boy, and Chairman Kim asked if he had his grandmother's dentures. The boy, Sang-yun, cried as he told them that he had already burned all the things that reminded him of his grandmother. Sang-yun kept crying, and Sang-deok reassured him that his grandmother is always with him. Sang-deok watched the family for a while before walking deeper into the woods, analyzing the ground until he saw a snake. Sang-deok and Yong-jun returned to the funeral home Yong-jun owned when Hwarim and Bong-gil came to visit them after a long time of not seeing each other. They talked and laughed around for a while before Hwarim proceeded to tell Sang-deok and Yong-jun about the Korean-American family that hired her to help them cure their baby's mysterious illness, which Hwarim identified as grave calling, a curse wherein a vengeful ancestor is haunting the family. Meanwhile, Ji-young's mother, Jeong-ja, expressed her disapproval of Ji-young hiring shaman and her protege. She doesn't trust that they can help them, and she believes that Ji-young is making the biggest mistake of his life. However, Ji-young had already made up his mind, and no one, not even his own mother, could stop him. As Jeong-ja kept on complaining about Ji-young's decision to trust Hwarim and Bong-gil, Ji-young just stayed silent as he trembled, remembering the screams of his father and the cries of his newborn son. Sang-deok and Yong-jun drove to their rendezvous with Hwarim, Bong-gil, and Ji-young. Sang-deok sat inside the car with Ji-young for privacy. Ji-young wanted Sang-deok to immediately cremate the grave without opening it, and this whole thing would be confidential, which caused Sang Daok to be wary. Sang Daok grew even more worried when he learned that the grave is located in a remote mountain near the North Korean border, and he explained that they needed to report to the district office first and open the coffin so the undertaker could collect the remains before they bury it somewhere else or cremate it. But Ji-young insisted on cremating the grave as soon as possible without opening the coffin. Sang Do-ok and Yong-jun headed to the gravesite, and the whole time, Sang Do-ok was worriedly wondering what was inside the coffin that Ji-young was so adamant on getting it cremated without even opening first. Sang Do-ok's worry just intensified when they reached the gravesite and saw how ominous the area was. Sang Do-ok analyzed the dirt and the tomb, noticing that there was no name on it. Sang Do-ok asked who made the tombstone, and Ji-young answered that it was a monk named Kitsun, who was close to their family and was the one to provide his grandfather with the grave location. The grandfather's grave was low-key and simple because tomb robberies were rampant by the time his grandfather was buried. Sang Do-ok felt a sinister energy from the tomb and decided to back out. Yong-gun, Hwarim, and Bong-gil followed Sang Do-ok and asked him why he was backing out. Sang Do-ok explained that for 40 years he had been digging the ground for a living, yet he had never heard of this grave site. That site is definitely not a place where the dead can rest, and he didn't want to touch a tomb that shouldn't be touched. Ji-young brought Sang Do-ok and Hwarim to the hotel he was staying at and revealed that he actually used to have 2 children before his newborn son, but both died from miscarriage, and now he desperately wanted to save his newborn son. Ji-young tried to convince Sang Do-ok by telling him about his children, as Sang Do-ok has children too. When Sang Do-ok was still reluctant, Hwarim suggested performing the evil replacing technique, which means dancing to gods while Sang Do-ok is moving the graves to avoid the curse, and the feng shui master finally agreed. They returned to the gravesite and prepared for the ritual and the moving of graves. The diggers and Ji-young's family watched for a while as Hwarim and Bong-gil performed the ritual. Once Hwarim started cutting the pigs, Ji-young hit the grave with the shove a few times before the digging began. Once they saw the coffin, the ritual stopped, and they checked the coffin, surprised to see that it was a cypress coffin, which used to be reserved for the royal family only. The coffin was carried to the hearse, and Yong-jun told the others to bury the tombstone and take care of the aftermath before driving the hearse away. The diggers buried the tombstone, and when one of them saw a snake, he severed its head, and the human-headed snake screamed, which resonated across the woods. Hwarim and Bong-gil rubbed their ears, seemingly having heard the screams that no one else did. Beheading the human-headed snake triggered a bad omen, and it suddenly started raining without any warning. The cremation was delayed because of the belief that if the body was cremated on such a rainy day, the dead would never go to a good place. So Sang Do-ok planned on placing the remains in the morgue of a nearby hospital first until they could finally proceed with the cremation. Sang Do-ok reassured Ji-young that they have an acquaintance in the hospital that can help keep the cremation of his grandfather confidential. While the coffin was being moved to the morgue, Park Ji-young's aunt reminded him that she was still opposed to the cremation. Sang Do-ok left Yong-gun to clean the coffin and headed to a rundown temple near the mountain where Ji-young's grandfather was buried. He asked the old man who had been taking care of the temple if the temple's abbot master, the one who built the temple, was named Kitsuna. But Sang Do-ok learned that it was a different abbot master who goes by the name Master Yuan Feng. Sang Do-ok asked if the man knew about the grave located at the top of the mountain, and the man answered that while he didn't know anything about it, he did hear several rumors about it. One rumor states that there were treasures buried in the tomb. Some say it was the tomb of the richest man in North Korea, while others say it was an unknown royal tomb. These rumors were what attracted tomb robbers in the past, but no one had ever gotten close to succeeding because it was so difficult to get close to the tomb. There were rumors claiming that some of the robbers were suddenly taken away, while others fled to the north. The old man showed Sang Do-ok the equipment used by the tomb robbers and asked what was inside the coffin that Sang Do-ok had taken. Meanwhile, Yong-jun left the coffin alone for a while to eat, unknowing of the local custodian who had taken an interest in the coffin. The local custodian sneaked into the morgue, where the coffin was, and forced the coffin open. Hwarim and Bongil came into the morgue to see what the local custodian was doing, but it was already too late. The coffin had already been opened and released the vengeful spirit, Ji-young's grandfather, that rested inside it. Hwarim fainted from the force she felt when the grandfather's spirit left the coffin and the local custodian fled. Sang-deok and Yong-gun rushed to the hospital where Hwarim was admitted, and Hwarim tended to her bleeding nose as she informed them about the evil spirit of the grandfather who was released from the coffin. The evil spirit they were talking about had gone to the patriarch's home and targeted his bloodline. Jong-sun was sitting in his wheelchair by the window when he saw his father's spirit hovering outside his closed window. The grandfather softly talked to his son, manipulating him into opening the window for him to enter. Jong-sun cried as he opened his window and waited for his father to get in. Jeong-ja, on the other hand, was drinking and dancing along to the show she was watching, unaware of Jong-sun's suffering and dying at the hands of his vengeful father. Jong-sun's father then targeted her next, dancing with her for a short while before taking her life. After killing his son and daughter-in-law, the next person he targeted was his grandson, Ji-young himself. Meanwhile, Hwarim asked Sang-deok to return to Seoul while she performed another ritual with Bongil and Yong-gun to make the soul return. Ji-young, who was unconscious due to his grandfather attacking him, gasped awake when his grandfather's spirit left and entered Bongil's body. Bongil was tied up by the waist as he danced until he abruptly stopped, staring at Hwarim. Yong-gun saw through the mirror that the grandfather had possessed Bongil. Hwarim asked the vengeful grandfather why he was tormenting his own family, and the grandfather answered that he wanted to take his children and grandchildren with him. Due to the improper burial the grandfather received, his spirit was constantly tormented by it, and he decided to avenge the mistreatment he received from his own family after his death. Bongil fell to the ground and started puking. Hwarim knew then that the grandfather had escaped. Sang-deok called Ji-young to inform the latter that he was visiting him at the hotel in Seoul he was staying in. They were still on a phone call when someone knocked on Ji-young's door, and when Ji-young asked who it was, he was stricken with fear when he heard Sang-deok on the other side of the door. The Sang-deok on the other line of the phone told him that whoever was at the door wasn't him, and that his grandfather's coffin had been opened. A scared Ji-young listened intently as the Sang-deok on the other line of the phone told him to open the window, reassuring him that he would be safe from his grandfather. However, the real Sang-deok was the one who was banging on the door, and his grandfather was actually the one he was talking to on the phone. Ji-young opened the window and was instantly filled with regret when he realized what a grave mistake he had made. A hotel staff member came to open the door to Ji-young's bedroom, and Sang-deok entered to see Ji-young standing on the coffee table, reciting the phrases that used to be declared by those who supported Japanese imperialism, before falling on his knees and vomiting out blood. The grandfather, who had possessed Ji-young, drank some water and said something about the fox splitting the spine of the tiger before breaking Ji-young's neck. Sang-deok glanced up and saw the reflection of the grandfather disappearing. Even though it was still raining heavily, Hwarim, Bongil, and Yong-gun decided to cremate the coffin with the help of Yong-gun's acquaintance. His acquaintance was reluctant at first, but eventually relented when he sensed the urgency of the situation. Meanwhile, Ji-young Cheo couldn't contact any of her family and decided to go back home to check on them, leaving her son with the nurse. Park Ji-young's aunt, on the other hand, was inside her room, looking at the picture of her family, which revealed the truth that the grandfather was a Japanese loyalist who supported Japan during the Korean occupation era. The family's accountant called her to inform her of what happened and how the aunt's father is about to target Ji-young's newborn son. The cremation couldn't happen without the permission of the mourner, and since the accountant couldn't contact Ji-young's parents, who, unbeknownst to them, were already dead, the accountant decided to ask for the aunt's permission instead. Time was running as the grandfather had already reached the newborn son, who had started crying and gasping for air at the sight of the vengeful spirit of his ancestor, whom an innocent baby like him couldn't possibly know. The aunt was still hesitating, as she was one of those who opposed the cremation in the first place, but understanding the gravity of the situation, She finally approved of the cremation. As soon as he received the go signal, Sang Deok called Yongjun and the cremation began, lifting the curse and saving the baby just on time. You'd think that it was finally over after lifting the curse and defeating the vengeful spirit of Ji Yong's grandfather. However, months later, Sang Deok heard the news of Chang Min being tormented. Chang Min was the gravedigger who beheaded the human-headed snake, and Sang Deok visited him to find him so disturbed and his bloodshot eyes now pouring out bloody tears. Chang Min requested that Sang Deok find the snake he killed and give it salvation. Only then did he believe he would finally find the peace that he lost after killing the snake. Sang Deok headed to the grandfather's previous gravesite by himself and dug until he found the human head of the snake. Sang Deok jumped away in fear, which caused his shovel to hit something buried on the ground. Sang Deok used his hands to dig the ground and found another casket buried right below where the grandfather's coffin used to be. Sang Deok was bothered by the realization that it was a stacked burial. He called Yonggun to inform him about his discovery and asked the mortician if he had ever seen a coffin buried upright like the one he had just found. Yongjun then went to the gravesite, followed by Hwarim and Bongil. They checked the large casket closely and found the dead vines wrapped around it, indicating that the casket isn't allowed to be opened from the outside. Bongil suggested digging the casket out and opening it, but Yonggun reminded him that they still needed to notify the bereaved first before they could do anything to the casket. Hwarim, who had been silent the whole time, told them to just not touch the casket at all. But Sang Deok ordered them to dig it out first, as the casket might be from the same family, so they didn't need any more permission. Hwarim worriedly watched as the three men struggled to pull out the casket, the large noise it created scaring the foxes away. As they stared at the casket, Yongdun loudly wondered if that coffin was containing human remains at all, due to how strangely large it was. Bringing the casket with them, Yongdun, Hwarim, and Bongil followed Sang Deok, who headed to the rundown temple to ask the old man for a favor. Sang Deok asked if they could stay overnight, as they couldn't move further with such a huge casket, and he reassured the old man that the mourner would be meeting them. The old man agreed and was flabbergasted by the size of the casket. Hwarim asked the old man for glutinous rice that they spread around the casket. After spreading the rice, Bongil went to their car to get some horse blood that they had poured on top of the glutinous rice. The aunt was called to see the casket, hoping that she'd be able to tell them anything about it, but even the aunt knew nothing about the stacked burial. The aunt was a bit distressed because of how her father was improperly buried in such a bad gravesite. And Sang Deok explained that it was because her father was quite known before for his betrayal, and he believes the monk punished him by having him buried improperly, which caused her father to be restless and tormented even to death. The aunt cut Sang Deok off, revealing that she knew that his father was a traitor to Korea, and Monk Kitsune was Japanese. Kitsune was an important person who had a thorough understanding of North Korea's geography, and it made no sense for him to punish the aunt's father when he'd been very loyal to the Japanese. After the short meeting, the aunt told Sang Deok's group to handle the large casket by themselves. Hwarim, Bongil, Sang Deok, and Yonggun stood around a burning barrel as Bongil led the prayer to Buddha. After the prayer, Hwarim suggested burning the casket immediately as soon as morning came, and everyone agreed, not wanting to deal with another vengeful spirit again in case the large coffin contains one. The group ate and slept for the night, except for Hwarim, who called an acquaintance to ask about Kitsune. Her acquaintance told her about the Japanese fox demon, and Hwarim ended the call, feeling strange as she fell asleep inside her car, unaware of the spirit sitting in the back seat. Meanwhile, the old man was preparing to go to sleep when a Buddha statue fell down. Bongil was woken by the bloody old man standing over him and repeatedly saying that someone had taken his liver. Bongil tightly closed his eyes and traced something on the floor before sitting up suddenly, the old man nowhere in sight. He went looking for the old man when he heard the cries of pigs. He peeked inside the barn to see what was happening and found a ghoul brutally killing the pigs and the old man. He woke Hwarim up, and they both checked the coffin to discover that whatever was inside had broken out. Hwarim looked up, and when she noticed the hole on the roof, she realized that the seal breaks upwards, which is why the coffin was buried upright, because it helped prevent whatever was inside the coffin from breaking out. Hwarim noticed that Bongil was scared of something and demanded that he speak up. Bongil couldn't say what he witnessed, and therefore just told Hwarim that whatever was trapped inside the coffin was in the barn. Hwarim told him to wake the others up while she stayed behind to check what was inside the coffin, and found a strange headgear, which caused her eyes to widen as she realized that the creature that used to be inside the coffin was an anima, a Japanese term for a samurai ghoul. Hwarim sensed a presence and cautiously approached the door, only to step back when a 7-footed creature stood right outside of it. Hwarim quickly bowed down to feign respect for the anima, calling herself its subordinate to appease it and prevent it from finding out she's a human. The anima kept on talking to her, but Hwarim was too scared to respond properly. Annoyed by her lack of response, the anima threw the head of the human he killed towards her, and Hwarim cowered in fear and disgust at the sight of it. The anima left the door and went up the rooftop to see that the subordinate it had been talking to was actually a human. Seeing as she had been caught, Hwarim ran out, and the anima chased after her, only to be impaled by Bongil. It didn't do any damage to the anima, and Bongil told Hwarim to run away. But Hwarim was rooted in her place as she watched the anima grab Bongil's head, possessing him before impaling his body with its bare hands. Bongil fell to the ground, and the anima approached Hwarim. Instead of attacking her, the anima started chanting a mantra and floating in the air as flames covered its entire body. Sangdeok and Yongjun arrived to see the anima turning into a ball of flame and flying around the air. They could only stare at the ball of flame as visions of the horrors they had witnessed flashed through their minds. After a while, the ball of flame flew away and back to the mountain where it came from. Hwarim ran to Bongil and screamed for Sangdeok and Yongjun to help them. However, Sangdeok and Yongjun could only stand there in a daze. At the hospital, Sangdeok and Yongjun were given antipyretic injections as they had high fevers, while Hwarim was waiting outside the emergency room where Bongil was being taken care of. Sangdeok sat beside her and apologized, for he was the one who insisted on digging the 7-footed coffin out even when Hwarim warned them not to touch it at all. Hwarim talked about how Bongil originally played baseball, but stopped playing when he became mentally ill. When Hwarim was abandoned by her family and decided to become a shaman, Bongil chose to be with her because, for him, as long as he had Hwarim, there was nothing to be afraid of. The topic then changed to the laws of shamanism. Hwarim explained that souls are unstable and ghosts have no body, which is why it is impossible to defeat an intact spirit with a physical body. The anima wasn't simply a vengeful spirit. It was a soul that attached itself to something and evolved. Hwarim was confused as to why the anima was buried right beneath the patriarch's grandfather. The doctor stepped out of the emergency room and informed Hwarim that Bongil's organs were severely damaged, including his spine, and he needed to be transferred to a bigger hospital immediately. Sangdeok was left standing alone in the hallway as he remembered what Ji-young's grandfather said about the fox splitting the tiger's spine before Ji-young died. Sangdeok then headed back to the rundown temple and entered the warehouse where the tomb robbers' equipment is. He found a book with a picture in it and discovered that the tomb robbers the old man talked about were actually a group of Korean patriots who used to dig around searching for a Japanese military conquest relic buried somewhere in Korea. The next day, Sangdeok went back to the mountain to dig around for the relic. Meanwhile, Hwarim asked 2 acquaintances to help her talk to Bongil, whose spirit was held hostage by the anima, which made him the anima's servant. When Bongil woke up, he talked about his master, who kills and becomes a god in the process. Hwarim asked where his master was, and Bongil answered with numbers that Hwarim didn't understand. Those numbers were the longitude and latitude that Sangdeok had found engraved on the tombstone, the exact location of where the anima should be. Sangdeok was still digging until he found the anima buried underneath it. A scared Sangdeok rushed to the funeral home to talk to Yongjun. Sangdeok mentioned what the grandfather said about a fox tearing the tiger's waist. And according to feng shui, the shape of North Korea's land is a tiger. Sangdeok explained to Hwarim his discovery and expressed his desire to beat the anima. When they found strange tattoos on Bongil's body, unlike his original tattoos, Hwarim, Sangdeok, and Yongjun copied them on their faces, and headed to the mountain, where they spread fish around to lure the anima once it woke up at midnight. Midnight came, and the anima indeed got lured by the fish they spread around. And Hwarim distracted the anima while Sang Deok and Yong Jun dug the grave in search of the iron stake that was said to be the relic. At the same time, Bongil was also saying what the anima was saying, and the two female shamans, who are also Bongil's relatives, stood guard by his bed. When the anima found Hwarim hiding behind the tree, Hwarim ran away and found Yonggun, who had run away from the grave, leaving Sangdeok to dig alone. The anima turned into a ball of flame again and hovered over Sangdeok before jumping into the ground, right where Sangdeok is. The anima approached Sangdeok and stabbed through his body. To help him, Hwarim poured horse blood on anima, which burned the anima and caused it to get away from Sangdeok in pain. This also hurt Bongil, who was still linked to the anima. Hwarim and Yonggun ran to Sangdeok to help him when the anima grabbed them both by the throat. There, visions flashed through their minds, and they saw how Kitsune embedded the katana inside the decapitated samurai's body and buried it beneath the grandfather's grave, which was used to hide the relic. The iron stake relic that the Korean patriots had been searching for is none other than the katana inside the anima's body. Sangdeok realized this, and with his knowledge of feng shui, he used the four realms, which were formed by fire, water, wood, and metal, to defeat the anima. After defeating the anima, Bongil returned to normal, and Sangdeok collapsed. He woke up at the hospital with Hwarim, Bongil, and Yonggun hanging around in his room. After a while, they all went back to their normal activities like nothing happened. But even as they tried to live normally, everything that had happened to them left a mark inside them that kept them from completely forgetting.